infiltration to discredit him and all kinds of things, JFK. But first I want to mention something that's just come across my desk. Seriously important. Fans of the show will know that I'm good friends with Stan Friedman, who's a Canadian legend, and happy Canada Day to everybody. Today is July the 1st. Stan has just taken a mild heart attack. Now I'm asking everybody who's listening for their prayers for Stan. So he has a speedy recovery, and I appreciate that greatly. Now, also I want to mention in the news, the 3 young Israelis that were taken by Hamas were murdered. Their bodies were found. I am tired, I am sick and tired of anti-Semitism. Everybody jokes and says that prostitution is the oldest of all vocations. I think anti-Semitism has it beat hands down. We've got to put an end to anti-Semitism and killing people just because of their ethnicity. Have we learned nothing? Have we learned nothing since the Holocaust? I'm putting it to you. Welcome to Night Fright. My name is Brent, Holland. We're going to go right to Joan Mellen. Joan, welcome to the show. Thank you for joining us, my friend.
Thank you, Brent. Good to hear you.
It's good to hear you. Are you in New York?
I am in Princeton, New Jersey.
In New Jersey. How's the weather in New Jersey tonight?
Hot.
Right on.
Very hot.
It beats the heck out of January, though, doesn't it?
Maybe. I just saw a fox run across my lawn.
Oh, wonderful, wonderful.
That's good luck.
Yeah, absolutely. Folks, we're going to get into it right away. Joan has many books out. Jim Garrison is one of them, A Farewell to Justice, which is the story of Jim Garrison's trial, and The Great Game in Cuba. I'm going to jump to it right away. Can you tell us how embedded was the CIA in the JFK assassination story?
Well, when Jim Garrison looked at Oswald, and Oswald, for the audience, lived in New Orleans between April and September of 1963, shortly before the assassination. And when Garrison started, of course, by reading the Warren Report, and then he looked at Oswald that summer, and he said not only was he not the lone assassin, but everyone he was with had something to do with CIA. Now, that's not entirely the whole story, as Garrison discovered, and as I discovered later, using the JFK Act documents. Oswald, in fact, was embedded with the FBI in New Orleans, and in fact there was a website discussion I did not enter into recently about how did Oswald find his way to Carlos Bringier's store. And Bringier was, to remind us, one of the Cuban with whom Oswald had an altercation on Canal Street when Oswald was giving out his Fair Play for Cuba leaflets. Now, it turns out, parenthetically, that Fair Play for Cuba, although it was an organization created by the Socialist Workers' Party in favor of Castro, had been infiltrated by the CIA, and in particular by David Atlee Phillips, who was their chief propaganda person. And so there's that. And Oswald found his way to Bringier's store prior to the altercation on Canal Street because he was led there by the FBI agent for whom Oswald was working, and that was Warren DeBruys. So we can't say it's only CIA, and also Orestes Pena, who ran a bar in New Orleans, observed Oswald frequently in the company of agents of U.S. Customs. But Garrison's chief suspect, after David Ferry died, David Ferry was a contract pilot for CIA who knew Oswald from the time that Oswald was a teenager in the Civil Air Patrol years before. When Ferry died, Garrison arrested the director of the International Trade Mart, whose name was Clay Shaw. And Garrison was certain that Clay Shaw had something to do with CIA, and in fact, an Italian newspaper that same month, which was March of 1967, that same month, an Italian newspaper of the independent left called Paese Sera published a series of articles about a CIA front in Europe, based partly in Switzerland and partly in Rome, called Permandex, and the one in Rome was called Centro Mondiale Commerciale, and the paper printed that Clay Shaw was on the board of directors. But although Garrison had those newspapers in hand at the time of the trial of Clay Shaw, he couldn't use newspapers because they're hearsay. you can't use a newspaper as evidence. And he didn't have the time or the money to do an investigation in Europe. So it turned out that at the trial of Clay Shaw, the only person who raised the issue of CIA was Clay Shaw's own lawyer. And the lawyer said, have you ever worked for CIA? Something to that effect. And Clay Shaw said, no, never. And it was left at that. Now, years later, when I was doing the update a year or so ago for A Farewell to Justice, it was republished in 2013, what should I find but a CIA document from the History Review Group? Now, that's an internal document for CIA. It's not meant to be seen by anyone outside. And it said, categorically, Clay Shaw was a highly paid contract agent of CIA.
Wow,
So,
that's explosive.
maybe highly paid contract asset of CIA. But the key words for me in that sentence was highly paid. If you're highly paid, although you might not be in CIA's category as employee, you are, in effect, an employee. You're paid. And so Garrison turns out to have been right on that and right on many, many other issues, which we can get into. But I'm going to let Brent have a word in edgewise here.
That's fine, Joan. Folks, if you're just joining us, I'm Brent, Holland. Welcome to Night Fright. Wonderful researcher with us tonight on the JFK case and many others. She's got a book out called The Great Game in Cuba. Jim Garrison is another book, and A Farewell to Justice, which I have on my bookshelf right behind me. Folks, www.nightfrightshow.com, www.nightfrightshow.com. Just click on tonight's guest book covers, plural, and that'll take you right to a spot where you can order the book from the comfort of your own home. And tonight in Canada, it is Canada Day, folks. The fireworks will be going off in a few hours. We're celebrating 147 years old, Canada. And it doesn't look a day over 146. Let's go back to Joan. Joan, I'm very curious about this. When was Oswald turned into an intelligence asset?
Well, that's a great question, Brent, because I don't know the answer. I like a question where I don't really know the answer. We know that Oswald was in the Marine Corps. We know he defected, quote unquote, to the Soviet Union, and I am not just putting those quotes around defected, because it turned out that in the update for A Farewell to Justice, I wrote a long piece on the head of the security in the State Department called Otto Otepka. And Mr. Otepka, one day before he fell into trouble, got a list of defectors with quotes around defector that he was supposed to look into and investigate. And on that list was Lee Oswald, tourist. Now, who put that those quotation marks around defector? It had to be, obviously, a government agency. It turned out at least as early as Oswald going into the Soviet Union, ostensibly he's defecting. Of course, he's not defecting. He's working for some kind of false defector program for CIA counterintelligence, which was run by James Angleton. So at least in, I would say, in 1959, we have Oswald as working for the intelligence services in some capacity. He comes back to the United States on money that's loaned to him by the State Department. In fact, when he goes to the American Embassy in Moscow and wants to turn in, it makes a big thing of turning in his passport. Who should be talking to him? Ostensibly the second consul, which was a person named Richard E. Snyder. But when we did further research, we found that Snyder was CIA. And not only that, but Snyder had been at Harvard University. He had been the recruiter for CIA at Harvard. And among the people whom he tried to recruit was Zbigniew Brzezinski, whom we still see around today, and who had been the security advisor for Jimmy Carter. Well, I don't know whether Brzezinski became a CIA asset or whatever, but certainly he was on the list of those whom Richard Snyder wanted to recruit for the agency and planned to send to Europe the coming summer. Here's Richard Snyder then in Moscow talking to Oswald, both of them agency, both of them putting on something of a show. Oswald attempting to give away his American passport and become a citizen of Soviet Union. Richard Snyder somehow not accepting the passport. He tries to lose his American citizenship, that's Oswald, but he doesn't succeed. So we can see that some is afoot here, and when Oswald leaves Soviet Union, he leaves with his Russian wife, whose uncle, well, as is well known, was a member of the Soviet intelligence, and here they come to the United States.
Now, is this part of a sheep-dipping operation that's going on with Oswald to make him look pro-communist?
Absolutely.
Okay,
absolutely.
Can you explain
Oswald comes to New Orleans, and he has all these leaflets, Fair Play for Cuba. Well, who would be in Fair Play for Cuba means pro-Castro, but he's not pro-Castro at all. He's supposedly read a lot of Marxist books, and it's all prepared so that at the time of the assassination, it can be said that a Marxist killed President Kennedy. Not only a Marxist, but somebody sent to Dallas by Fidel Castro. That was the original plan, that Castro would be blamed for the assassination. Somewhere along the way, CIA gives up that idea, and they decide to present Oswald as a lone assassin, not under the control of any foreign government, whether it's Cuba or Soviet Union. There was absolutely no evidence for. But you can see how they tried to prepare Castro as the a person who planned the assassination. When that doesn't work, there's Oswald by himself. He's still, I think I've said this often, but it's worth repeating. I think when he's arrested in Dallas, he asks for a lawyer named John Abt, who was a leading Communist Party lawyer. Now, what is he doing? He's signaling to his handlers, look, I'm still with the program. Don't desert me. Don't leave me here. Of course, it's too late. They've already decided that Oswald is going to be expendable, and he's gone. But he did try at the end there. He didn't say anything like, wait a minute and talk. He never talked. And Jim Garrison said later, if Oswald had been alive, he'd still be talking, which is typical of Garrison's hyperbole. He'd still be talking, and maybe he would, because he had a lot to say about what went on. So the other side of CIA's involvement in Garrison's investigation is the many plants that CIA sent into Garrison's office to steal documents, to spy on him, and there was just people in the press, people and constantly reporting back on everything that Garrison was doing. So there was nothing that Clay Shaw's lawyers didn't know about who his witnesses were and so forth. In those days, it was not required by law that the prosecution present its list of witnesses to the defense, but they got them anyway.
Joan, in your opinion, do you feel that Oswald was part and parcel to setting himself up, if you will, as a pro-communist in order perhaps to take part in a future operation, perhaps even to kill Castro?
Definitely, because when I was doing the research up in Jackson and in Clinton, Louisiana, and there was a marvelous from the point of view of revelation. There was a scene of Oswald had been asked, part of his assignment was to get a job at the East Louisiana State Hospital at Jackson, which was, quote unquote, an insane asylum. And there's Oswald talking in a room, wearing a sloppy T-shirt and talking to the people, not about being a Marxist, but about going to Cuba to kill Castro. That's really what I think Oswald thought he was doing, and that's why he was training in some of the training camps near Lake Pontchartrain. He was going to be part of that movement. And it just so happened that the director of the East Louisiana State Hospital was walking by, and he hears that he was Cuban, although he had come to the United States in, I think, 1954 or 55, before Castro. But his name was Dr. Frank Silva. And he walks by the room, and he hears this sloppy-looking fellow ranting and raving about how he was going to use his Marine manual and go down to Cuba and kill Castro. And he said to himself, because he told me this, I interviewed him for the book, he said to himself, no way this man gets a job in he was medical director of the hospital, no way this man gets a job in my hospital. So the CIA plan, which is clearly put Oswald into the insane asylum, perhaps he escapes, in some way he gets out, he finds himself in Dallas and is arrested, and here we have a fugitive from an insane asylum who was killed President Kennedy. And that was, I think, pretty clearly that was what was done. The way Oswald got up there to the East Louisiana State Hospital, he didn't drive a car, was with Clay Shaw, who ultimately would be put on trial for by Jim Garrison, and Clay Shaw. And when Clay Shaw was on the stand at the trial, he said he never met Oswald and he never met David Ferrie. But it just so happened that on that day that Oswald went up to Clinton, see, well, on the application for the hospital it said, "Are you a registered voter in East Feliciana Parish?" as part of the question whether you could get a job at this hospital. Well, of course, Oswald wasn't. He'd been living in New Orleans and only for a short time. So when he went to register to vote in East Feliciana Parish, he named as people whom he knew who were registered voters several of the doctors at the hospital. One was Frank Silva, and the other was a doctor called Dr. Malcolm Pearson. Now, Frank Silva despised Pearson, but that's neither here nor there. A few days later, when it turned out they decided up there not to use those names of those doctors, and so it was erased from the records. But Oswald was brought up to Clinton, and what I was saying was, that day that Oswald was brought up there to register to vote, it turned out that there was a voter registration drive by the Congress of Racial Equality, CORE. So everybody's out in the streets, especially African-American people, trying to get around all the questionnaires and the poll tax and whatever and vote, and just two white people. So Oswald stood out like a sore thumb, and everybody remembered his being there. White witnesses, judges, lawyers, the district attorney, African-Americans, the chairman of CORE, whose name was Corey Collins, everybody was out, and later many of these people became witnesses for Garrison at the trial of Clay Shaw. He was seen with Oswald, he was seen with Ferrie. So when Clay Shaw said on the stand he never met Oswald, he never met Ferrie, Garrison at once thought, okay, even if he loses the case, which he did, Shaw was acquitted, he could charge Shaw with perjury. Because, of course, there were so many witnesses that said he did know Oswald, he did know Ferrie. And then it turned out that the case was remanded to federal court, although it was not a federal case. And the Judge Christenberry, dismissed the case. So Shaw was not convicted of perjury. He was acquitted, and Garrison didn't care. He said, look, Clarence Darrow lost the Scholes case, the case for teaching the thoughts of Charles Darwin. And so it didn't make any difference. Everybody thinks he won. And as far as Garrison was concerned, he just continued his investigation. Ultimately, the federal government then framed him for taking bribes as district attorney from the pinball interest. This is mob interest to control pinball. Pinball was paid off by the bartender. You could play pinball, but not for money. And Garrison was accused of taking bribes from these pinball owners. He was acquitted, but at that he was so exhausted from that trial, it was very difficult. He had to dismiss his lawyer and represent himself and so forth, that he didn't campaign that coming November for the election, and he lost by 2,200 votes. By the father of the singer, Harry Connick Jr. The father, Harry Connick, created cufflinks that he gave out to all his supporters that had the number 2,200 written on it. And that's how Garrison had to stop doing his investigation. He never gave up thinking about it, writing about it, asking about it, but of course, no longer being in the office of the district attorney, he didn't have the resources to go out and investigate on the street.
Joan, you had a chance to meet Jim Garrison before he passed away. What type
I met
of
Jim Garrison a long time ago. I didn't meet Jim. I met Jim Garrison in 1969. That's long. It's just after the Shaw trial. Shaw was tried on March 1st, I think, 1969, and my husband and I came down to New Orleans in May. Now, my husband had been living in Europe, and so he had found those Paese Serra newspaper clippings, and so he had mailed them to Jim Garrison. And Garrison was grateful, and so we came down to New Orleans. It was my first time there. There's a picture of me and Garrison in the Farewell to Justice. I look pretty kind of sick. That's because I was. It's terrible air there. You can't breathe. I immediately got some kind of flu or asthma attack, so I'm sitting there. Garrison doesn't notice anything. He's talking about the Kennedy assassination. assassination. And you know, all that weekend, Garrison never once mentioned that he had lost the case against Clay Shaw. It was as if it didn't even exist. He also never mentioned that he was district attorney of Orleans Parish. We're walking down the street to a restaurant, and many African-American people are saying hello to Mr. Garrison. And I was so sick, somebody had to come up to the room and close the drapes, and the sunlight was killing me. And the person who came up to do that, hello, Mr. Garrison. And I was so surprised. I couldn't understand why are all these people saying hello to Jim Garrison. It didn't interest him that he was district attorney. Political power didn't interest him. He could have become governor, didn't interest him. All he wanted to do was talk about the Kennedy assassination. So I saw him first in May 1969, and we were in touch for many years after that. And the last time I saw him, I had dinner with him in 1987. And Oliver Stone was already working on JFK, and Garrison mentioned, oh, by the way, there's a film being made. Very sardonic, very quiet about it, not a great celebration, just mentioned there's a film being made. He had his eye on the right things. He believes in the right values, I think. What was important to him was figuring out who killed President Kennedy. And that was really it might be odd to people who think that other people want money, they want fame, they want notoriety, they want what they want. Garrison wasn't like that. And he was unlike anyone that I ever saw in New Orleans, or all the people that I interviewed. I interviewed, I think, about 1,200 people for that book. I worked a long time on Farewell to Justice. And then when I updated it, I think you'll see the 90-page update. It's together at the end, all together it says update. It's different because I learned so much about CIA in the course of doing this research. And one of the things I did in the update was to put a sort of a tape, like a discussion, of taking apart CIA, all the different components and how they interact with each other, and how one component doesn't talk to the others, what the role of the Office of Security was. And I found out that the Office of Security, which is a very powerful component of CIA, in all the cities where the CIA had field offices, the Office of Security had separate offices. And it was through the Office of Security that the CIA plans were put into Garrison's office as part of what CIA called the Confidential Correspondence Program. Sounds very innocent, doesn't it? But that's how it was done, because we wondered, it was so difficult, and I think we still don't have everything, so difficult to take apart exactly how this worked. We have that moment that Victor Marchetti was a former CIA employee, and after he left the agency, he told about how one morning he heard Richard Helms say, Richard Helms then I think was running the Richard Helms was Director of Central Intelligence, I think, in 1967. We hear Helms talking to his assistant, Thomas Karamessides, and saying, are we doing enough for that guy down there? And that guy down there was Clay Shaw. And it was clear to everyone in the room that was what he was talking about. As it turned out, I don't think Helms did enough for that guy down there. They really let him go through hell and go through the trial. And perhaps Clay Shaw knew that he would ultimately get out of it and he'd be acquitted. But it was a rather rough couple of years there.
You mentioned Oliver Stone in the movie JFK. Now, folks, everybody that has seen that movie knows that Oliver Stone uses magnificently Kevin Costner to play Jim Garrison, to walk us through all the lore, all the different aspects of the assassination. Ultimately, in your research, Joan, do you feel that Clay Shaw was guilty of participating or planning the assassination?
I don't think he planned the actual assassination. That he participated, there's absolutely no doubt. First of all, I believe that Perry Russo, who was Garrison's chief witness, we haven't talked about Perry Russo yet. Perry Russo told the truth when he talked about that party that he attended at David Ferry's apartment, also attended by Clay Shaw, who went under the name that night of Clem Bertrand. And we'll talk, if you want to talk about that Bertrand alias. But at that party, Ferry and Shaw both told what their alibis would be on November 22nd, 1963, the day of the Kennedy assassination. And David Ferry said he would be at his college, I think Southwest or whatever, small college outside New Orleans. And Shaw said he'd be in San Francisco. And both of those people were on that date, that weekend. That's exactly where they were. So so what I did in order to revive Perry Russo's reputation was on the cover of the new edition of A Farewell to Justice, I put a picture of Garrison and Perry Russo. And Perry Russo was sitting at the desk and looking over some papers. And I got that photograph because it was taken by Life photographer Lynn Pelham. Life magazine was planning to do a story about Jim Garrison. And then, I don't know whether CIA leaned on them. They were heavily infiltrated themselves, Life, by CIA. But suddenly the story was canceled, and none of the photographs were ever used. So the photographer, Lynn Pelham, he just decided he gave me all the contacts free as his contribution to helping Jim Garrison. Garrison was dead, of course. He died in 1992. But he gave me that photograph on the cover is one of the photographs of Lynn Pelham. It's really quite interesting because it shows Garrison with a sidearm, which is something that he took up later in the investigation. Perry Russo died some years later, still absolutely declaring that what he said was true, and that he said Ferry was there, Shaw was there, and there was no question about it. And I think when Garrison first got Perry Russo in the office, they drove to Shaw's house on Dauphin Street, I think 1313 Dauphin Street, where it had a red door, and they knocked on the door. Shaw came to the door, and Perry Russo was confronted with him to make an identification, and it was Shaw. So I think they did all the standard police practices quite correctly in the Orleans Parish District Attorney's Office. Naturally, CIA set forth its media assets, and that's another place where CIA's footprint exists on the Garrison case. There is a CIA document. It's dated April 4th, 1967, which is how media assets of the CIA should handle criticisms of the Warren Report. See, in Garrison, although it was 1967, it's very interesting. Garrison's name is not mentioned. But one of the ways that CIA suggests that criticisms of the Warren Report be handled was to say that it's a CIA plot. KGB was behind the assassination. KGB was behind Garrison. That this KGB controlled Garrison, and that's why he was blaming CIA for the assassination.
Let's talk about Walter Sheridan. I want to talk about Walter Sheridan, too, and how he undermined Garrison's investigation.
That's another interesting story because Walter Sheridan was an all-purpose, I think he worked for many agencies. He had worked for National Security Agency, he had worked for CIA, and he also worked for Robert Kennedy, which makes this add something to the story. Suddenly, Walter Sheridan, this is before the trial, it's even before Shaw was arrested. Don't forget, everybody knew what Garrison was doing. They knew he was going to arrest Shaw because all the spies in the office sent this out. And so suddenly Walter Sheridan comes down to New Orleans. He makes no bones about it. He talks to a Office of Naval Intelligence operative called Guy Johnson. He talks to the FBI down there, and he says he's going to discredit Garrison. He's going to destroy his case. And he said it openly. And then so Sheridan at that time was posing as an NBC TV reporter. You know, that was one of his covers. So he's planning a white paper. And his purpose was to turn Garrison's witnesses against him and put them on the show. And he got a bunch of people that were, for one way or another, vulnerable and available, and they put out the white paper. And it's not very convincing. If you look at it today, it's laughable, actually. But Garrison was quite upset. He wrote to the FCC and asked for equal time. They didn't give him equal time. I think the white paper was an hour, and they gave him 20 minutes. Was it 30 minutes, something like that? It wasn't the full hour. But Garrison just sits at the edge of a desk in his reply and defines his case and defines what he was doing. And very convincing, very quiet, smoking his pipe, just describing everything, very calm. I think he did a great job on that. Walter Sheridan now comes back into A Farewell to Justice. I didn't know he was going to come back. But when I was writing about Otto Otepka, remember I said that Oswald's name was on the list of defectors and Otepka was investigating Oswald. Well,
That's right.
Sheridan and Bobby Kennedy conspire, and they steal all the files out of Otepka's safe, and they also tape everything that Otepka's saying, and the tapes are delivered by to Walter Sheridan in the corridor, and somebody was a witness and saw that. So here's Walter Sheridan doing, I don't know, he did a lot of dirty tricks for Bobby Kennedy. Another thing that he did was to undermine the Hoffa case, and illegally, because he taped Hoffa's meetings with his own lawyer and tried to use them in the trial. And Sheridan was a criminal. He worked for the government, but he was certainly a criminal, a really awful individual. You have to read about him in the book to see just how devious, how illegal everything he did was.
Joan, how did he fool Bobby to becoming his right-hand man?
Bobby Kennedy was not a saint. And I think that we have to get over, I don't know how you all feel in Canada about Bob. Maybe I should ask you that. Looking at this story, here, one of the problems with studying the Kennedy assassination is a certain sector of the research community that has put the Kennedys on a pedestal as saints, literally saints. In fact, there's a book called The Untouchable, The Unspeakable. And it presents, and you look at the cover, he's the saint. He can do no wrong. The world is, and I think that if you look at both Kennedys, Bobby particularly, you will find not as people who are politicians, people who had their own interests, people who had their own methods. Bobby Kennedy was a loose cannon. One of the things I found that made everybody angry was I'm down in Miami, and I meet a Cuban called Angelo Morgado, but he changed his name to Kennedy. So he was called Angelo Kennedy, and he worked for Bobby Kennedy. And he described to me how during the summer of 1963, he went to New Orleans to investigate whether there were any threats against President Kennedy. And he meets Oswald. They find Oswald in one of those training camps, and they find out also, because they were not bad as investigators, that Oswald was working for the FBI, as I said earlier. And so Angelo goes back to Bobby Kennedy and tells him all this, and then Bobby Kennedy says, we don't have to worry because the FBI has him under control. Now, obviously, that's a mistake, and they paid for it dearly, but so Bobby Kennedy devoted his life to covering up the assassination, not wanting it to be investigated. He tried to obstruct Garrison's investigation in every way he could. Now, why did he do that? Well, it might have been his role in Operation Mongoose, which we can get to, which was a plan to kill Castro. It might have been because he himself had met Oswald or knew about Oswald and hadn't done anything about it. Angelo Morgado told... Sorry,
Joan,
go ahead.
Bobby Kennedy met Lee Harvey Oswald?
He didn't meet him personally. I take that back. What he did is he knew about him.
Okay.
Because his man, Angelo Morgado, met Oswald in the summer and reported back about it to Bobby Kennedy. I thought for a moment somebody had told me that Bobby Kennedy had given a speech at Homestead Air Force Base and Oswald was in the audience. I could not confirm that, and boy, I tried, because when someone told me that, I thought, well, of course I have to check that out. I could not confirm it, so we'll just forget about that. But that he knew about Oswald, there's no doubt.
Joan, once Bobby heard Oswald's name in association, if he knew his background in association with his brother's murder, the alarm bells must have went off, like, all get out.
Well, the alarm bells went off, of course, at the time of the assassination. And then what the Kennedy family did, and of course Bobby was really directing what everybody did, what the Kennedy family did was to obstruct the assassination in every way they could. I'll give an example of that. Just as the Clay Short trial was about to start, Jim Garrison went into federal court in Washington, D.C., and asked for the photographs of the autopsy and photographs and x-rays, whatever they had. And he sent his, one of his best assistant district attorneys down there to argue the case. Now, the person, his name was Numa Bertel, he did a great job, and he won. And the judge said, yes, you can have these materials for the study of the assassination. Let's see what you come up with. Go ahead. Well, the prosecutor said, so then the judge said to the prosecutor, are you going to appeal? the and I guess I don't know if you call me a defendant or the plaintiff for the moment, but anyway, the man said, I have to make a telephone call. He calls the Kennedy family, and they say, appeal. And by the time, so the short trial had already started now, and of course it was too late. It was a moot point, and they let it go. It would take a long time to do that appeal and all of that. So that's just one example that I know from the Garrison case. But if you look at all the years and years that occurred between 1963 and 1968 when Bobby Kennedy was assassinated, you can see there was absolutely, Bobby Kennedy kept saying he believes in the Warren Report. And he said it all over the world. He said it in Krakow, Poland. He said it I don't know where. And he then, according to somebody who wrote a book about it, and I don't think it's credible, he said, well, when he gets to be president, he'll investigate it. Well, how do you know he's going to be president? And Jim Garrison was really upset. He had hoped, he said, he must have sent a message, or he just said, listen, if you know something, in order to protect yourself, tell whatever you know as soon as you know it. So then if you don't have anything left to hide, they can't get you. They have no reason to kill you. I think he said this probably after Bobby Kennedy was assassinated. Garrison himself always did that. People often ask me, how come Garrison wasn't killed? How come, and of course he had his troubles, but they didn't kill him, and the reason every time he knew something, he told it. He had a press conference. And people thought that he was just wanting to hog the spotlight and get notoriety, but it wasn't that at all. The other thing I found out about Bobby Kennedy, and you could take this, audience, if you take it as it is, I found that Operation Mongoose now was an operation run by CIA to kill Fidel Castro. The person in charge was William Harvey, and his right-hand man was named CIA longtime employee officer Sam Halpern. And Bobby Kennedy took an office at CIA and was getting involved in the operations of Operation Mongoose. And one of the things that Sam Halpern noticed, Bobby Kennedy asked for a CIA person to be assigned to him. His name was Charles Ford. He went under the alias Fiscalini, Charlie Fiscalini. And Bobby Kennedy asked Fiscalini to go to Canada, to find some mafia hitmen to kill Castro. He didn't want to do it within the United States, but here's Bobby Kennedy, who was supposedly the scourge of the mafia, and he wanted to put all the mafia in jail, and he deported Carlos Marcello from New Orleans and all of that, going to Canada to hire mafia to kill Castro. Now, as we know, it didn't happen. But Sam Halpern...
Did he go to Montreal for that? 'Cause that's the...
I don't know where he went, but he was up there. And you'll see Canada, by the way, coming in the Garrison case in my book quite a few times, where people are going to and fro from Canada, including Clay Shaw. But no, but the one thing I wanted to say was the source for this about Bobby Kennedy was a CIA officer, Rational, and so forth. And I don't blame CIA when it isn't their operation. They get blamed for it when actually somebody else is doing it. And it wasn't us. It wasn't us. And I think the same thing, well, I'm not going to go into the USS Liberty. That's what I'm working on now. But when it wasn't us, we don't want to take the blame for that. And that was what was true really during Mongoose. It was not CIA's, really. It was Bobby Kennedy who was the wild card there. We who knew Bobby Kennedy in the years when he ran for president have no great love for Bobby Kennedy, because at the time of the Vietnam War, just an aside, Senator Eugene McCarthy was the person who represented the anti-war point of view in the presidential election of 1968. Johnson had stepped down, and people thought they had a chance. And as soon as McCarthy did well in the state of New Hampshire, Bobby Kennedy, who said that he wasn't running, suddenly decides to run. It's all fair in love and war, maybe, but it was unseemly to people who looking at that. So.
Folks, if you're anything like me, I'm keeping specifically silent tonight, because when you have a researcher of the ilk of Joan Mellen on the show, you keep quiet and you learn. Folks, Joan Mellen has books out called The Great Game in Cuba, Jim Garrison, and A Farewell of Justice, and many, many more. www.nightfrightshow.com. Click on tonight's guest book cover. That'll take you right to a spot. And get the books, folks. This is incredible research she's done, and she's been doing it for years. She actually knew Jim Garrison. Jim Garrison, of course, is portrayed by Kevin Costner in the movie JFK. And it takes us through the whole trial and the evidence that he brings forward, and Joan can attest to that. Joan, I want to ask you now, you had mentioned William Harvey and J.M. Wave and Sam Halpern. William Harvey have anything to do with the planning of the assassination? I've heard that rumor was floating around at the Dallas conference, actually, in November.
To my knowledge, no.
Okay, fair enough.
But I don't know. I think one of the things we have to say is that we know a lot about CIA's involvement here. Their footprints are everywhere. We know they set forth their media assets practically the day Jim Garrison began. We know they set plants in his office. We know Oswald's connection to CIA. What we don't have is the scene at which the assassination was planned and by whom. And we can certainly take a guess. We can see that David Atlee Phillips, for example, was seen at those training camps outside New Orleans. We can see, according to Antonio Veciana, this is a point that was developed by the great researcher for the House Select Committee, Gaten Fonzie, that Oswald was seen with Phillips in Dallas by Veciana, and Phillips was Oswald's handler, really, his chief handler. We know that, and Phillips, as we know, is very instrumental. He had engineered the coup in 1954 against President Arbenz in Guatemala. We know, so we put Phillips in there. Helms, I don't see, there's nothing that happened in CIA that Helms wasn't aware of. That's for sure, and I even am finding Helms in the USS Liberty case. And Helms, he's figured also, of course, in Chile and the unseating of President Allende, et cetera, et cetera.
Well, let's stay there for a second.
Who was it, though?
Yeah,
I'm sorry?
Let's stay there for a second and talk about Dick Helms. In Oliver Stone's movie, Nixon, he vilifies him as the persona of evil, if you will. There's one scene, actually, where he's talking about assassinations and control of the country and things of that nature with Nixon himself, and Oliver Stone blacks his eyes out to make him look like he's some kind of devil demon or something. How do you feel about Dick Helms? Do you think that's an accurate portrayal? Did Oliver Stone?
He was really ice cold, a real old-time operative, ruthless, all kinds of dirty tricks. Nothing escaped him. I wouldn't be. He'd be my first suspect. But I want to also mention something else before I forget about Oliver Stone's film. When I saw the film, this sort of gets me into it. When I saw the film, one of the things, JFK, right? When I saw JFK, and I saw Edward Lansdale mentioned as being in Dealey Plaza. I thought, Oliver Stone made a tremendous mistake there. Subsequently, your Canadian friend, do you know Black Op Radio, Len Osanic?
Oh, sure, I know Len personally.
Well, Len, was the custodian of the papers of Fletcher Prouty, and among the papers of Fletcher Prouty is a correspondence between Prouty and a general at the Pentagon called Victor Krulak. And Prouty sent Krulak some photographs of Dealey Plaza of General Lansdale, and Krulak, without saying anything, not naming who it is, and Krulak says, "What's Ed doing there?" He identified Lansdale from his ring, from his hand, from the way he was walking, and so Stone was really right. That's the one error that I found in the film, and it turns out that Lansdale was in fact there. And then something else is interesting about Lansdale that needs to be said. Lansdale looks like a general. He looks like he's Air Force. He looks like he's working for the Pentagon, and it isn't true. His Air Force cover, his Pentagon cover, all his life was cover for the fact that he was CIA from start to finish. And one proof of that is that when he was about to retire shortly before, Lansdale wanted to be promoted as Brigadier General. The people at the Pentagon said no, no, and Alan Dulles interfered, that Alan Dulles being the mastermind of CIA before he was Director of Central Intelligence and after. He created CIA, although his name is not on the list, and he wrote a letter to the Pentagon, and lo and behold, Lansdale is promoted to brigadier general on the strength of Dulles' demand that he be promoted. So we can see, and I think this is really an important point in doing this research, we can see if we're looking at the balance of power between Pentagon and CIA, what we can see is CIA is on the top and Pentagon is the implementer. The military, yes. The military is taking its orders from CIA. And one of the things that bothered President Kennedy, quite rightly, was that CIA was making policy. Now, if you talk to anyone in CIA or it's been, oh, no, never, we never, but in fact, that's exactly what they were doing, and Kennedy had a whole list of things. Among them was, of course, that the CIA knew about the missiles in Cuba, the Soviet missiles, and told a horrible senator from New York called Kenneth Keating about it, and Keating went on the floor of the Senate and talked about it, and Kennedy is watching this, and he says, how did he find all that out? The CIA, in other words, reported to other people other than the president himself. So there we can see that too, I think, tells us President Kennedy, throughout his presidency, short as it was at war with CIA.
Completely agree with you.
Sorry,
I
go ahead.
completely agree with you because I think the CIA was not only making policy but almost acting as a shadow government. I mean, Kennedy told them to stop operations against Cuba, and they continued on their own.
Everything they did on their own. He told them not to be involved in the assassination of Trujillo. No, they didn't kill him themselves. They only provided the weapons. President Kennedy finds out about it after the fact. So President Kennedy retaliates. He decides that he's going to limit the powers of the Director of Central Intelligence. He's going to limit their budget. They've been running wild and taking as much money as they wanted, and so forth. And they wanted to take over, President Kennedy wanted to take over Radio Swan, which was David Atlee Phillips' propaganda radio station in the Caribbean. And I found out, this is my research, I'm going to take some credit for this, and that is I found out from one of the soldiers of fortune down in Miami that Kennedy sent Richard Goodwin, who was one of his chief aides, husband of Doris Kearns Goodwin, that down there to talk to these soldiers of fortune and ask them to take over radio, on behalf of President Kennedy, to take over Radio Swan from CIA. And do you know what they did? They said no. They refused him. Imagine, the power was such that the soldiers of fortune down there were trying to so-called fight against Castro, where loyalty was to CIA rather than to the President of the United States. And one of them told me, the one that actually said, no, we're not taking it, too bad, we're not doing it, President Kennedy was the last president who thought he could take power. And now of course, subsequently, none of these presidents have power. They're just really doing the bidding of the Pentagon and CIA and whomever. I mean, this person now that we have has no power at all. And everybody says he's weak and so forth. Well, of course he is. He's not president. He doesn't exercise powers that we had believed the president should have. And when we look back at certain presidents, for example, President Eisenhower, 1952 to 1960, we can see there's a president that made decisions. Maybe we don't agree with them all, but he really made changes. He didn't want war, and he didn't have war. He got out of Korea and so forth. And after that, it was downhill after that. Really, it was, as some people have said, a coup d'etat. When President Kennedy was killed, that just put the punctuation on it and said, this is what's going to be from now on. And then we have all these wars, especially, of course, Vietnam, Iran, Iraq, whatever, not Iran yet, I guess, Afghanistan. And there it is. The policy of permanent war certainly was not something that President Kennedy wanted, that he didn't believe in.
And, Joan, you had mentioned Colonel Fletcher Prouty before, and Len Osanik's great show, Black Op Radio, folks. Just do a Google on it, and Len has a show every week specifically on the Kennedy assassination. He does a fine job out of BC, British Columbia. I just wanted
by the way,
Sure.
Where are you?
I'm in a place called Kingston. Kingston
Where is that?
It's about an hour and a half north of Syracuse. It's right where the Lake Ontario meets the St. Lawrence River. And it's right between Toronto and Montreal, dead center. It is our version of, it's a place in the States where they train all the military folks.
I was up in northern Vermont last week
You
interviewing
should have
someone.
stopped by for a coffee.
Oh, I see. It's not that far, right?
No, it's not that far.
Wow, because I said we're 5 miles from the Canadian border. I was all excited about that. But I was doing my thing there and doing very focused on taping and doing my interviews. But
Muzzle tough. That's great.
Anyway,
I just want to mention,
I've always
too.
enjoyed being on Leno Sanik's show.
Oh, he's a great guy. He's a terrific
Because
guy.
he gives every guest its due. He doesn't argue. He doesn't attack. He doesn't, it's just, let's tell us what you know, what you have to say. So it's always relaxing. This is relaxing too, by the way, Brent.
Thank you very much. It's very kind of you. I should also just wanted to mention Colonel Fletcher Prouty. If you look at the movie JFK, Donald Sutherland, the Canadian folks, plays Colonel Fletcher Prouty. It's a bit of a classic character, but that'll give you an idea of who Colonel Fletcher Prouty was and how important.
Well, and I just want to say one thing about that scene, Mr. X, which played by Donald Sutherland that you mentioned, Brent, and that is that Garrison did get to know Fletcher Prouty, not at the time of his investigation, but some years later. So it's not, people, that's a fake, but it really wasn't. Prouty did teach Garrison and help Garrison to understand the inner workings of CIA and all of that. So it's fitting that he should be a character in the film.
Absolutely. By the way, what did Oliver, I was going to ask you two questions. What did Oliver have to say? I know you ran into him several months ago when you were down at Cyril Weck's conference. What did Oliver have to say all these years later about the accuracy of the movie JFK and how...
I was stronger on the accuracy than he was. He was a little apologetic. You see, I think we have to bear in mind that the movie JFK is a dramatic fiction film. It's not a documentary, and there's some license that he took. And for example, he had composite characters because, for example, Perry Russo, who was so crucial, and I mentioned him before, who was so crucial to the Garrison investigation, obviously didn't give permission to Oliver Stone to use his name. So he has a composite figure who's, I think it's played by Kevin Bacon in a prison, and it's really meant to be several people, including Perry Russo. But Oliver Stone was a little, my film is not really accurate. I have to say that I think it is accurate. I'm not interested in the fact that Kevin Costner is short and Garrison was 6'6", or that Kevin Costner had the wrong accent. One of the things that happened, this is off the scene, Oliver Stone asked me to send him a copy, this is before the book was published, of the introduction and maybe the first chapter. He wanted to send it to Kevin Costner. And I think what he was saying, Kevin Costner obviously must have kicked up a storm. Why you dragged me into this? When the film there was so much criticism of the film, particularly in the New York Times. And he said, look, Stone was saying to Costner, look, see, I didn't lead you down the garden path. This is really what I said about Garrison is true. I think the film is overwhelmingly true. When I interviewed Stone, this is also before, obviously, when I was writing the book, I said, this isn't an accurate picture of Garrison's domestic life. He didn't have a happy marriage the way we see it in the film. And he said, well, I could have given 15 more minutes and, shown more about his personal life. When I look back on it now, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter that Garrison didn't appear at the trial all the time. He gave the opening statement and he gave the closing statement. These are minor things. It seems to me, my students...
Hang on to that, Joan, because we've got the break now for 6 minutes. We're going to be back in 6 minutes, folks. Joan Mellen is our guest tonight. We're looking at JFK from a different angle. She's an outstanding researcher. I'm Brent Holland from Night Fright. When we come back, I'm going to ask Joan specifically more about Oswald and the shoplifting, and if Oswald took the shot at JFK that day. See you in 6 minutes, folks. Hang on, Joan.
Okay.
Welcome back, everybody. My name's Brent Holland. Welcome back to Night Fright. Our guest tonight, Joan Mellen. The books, The Great Game in Cuba, Jim Garrison and a Farewell to Justice, www.nightbrightshow. Click on tonight's guest book cover, and that'll take you right to a spot where you can order these great books from the comfort of your own home. And her research is outstanding. She's on the phone live from New Jersey, and I want to just reference another great American that helps me out weekly, and his name is Kelly Logue. He's up in Juneau, Alaska. Kelly, thank you so much for putting the website together. Every week, folks, I just couldn't do the show without his help. I'll be quite honest. He just takes care of everything on the web for me, and there's a heck of a lot up there. There's a lot that he does. And he goes, he just does it for free. He's a volunteer like I am. Nobody makes any money off this show. We're just doing it for the love of trying to get the truth out. And I have to thank him always from the bottom of my heart. Thank you, Kelly, my friend. By the way, he's a book author, and I'm hoping his book will be out this year. And when it is, folks, get ready. He will make a live appearance on this show. Let's go back to Joan. And Joan, we have a caller from Nevada, and his name is William. And I should tell you a little bit about William. He is David Lifton's lawyer, and he's got a question for you, Joan, if you don't mind taking it.
Not at all. I don't know whose lawyer. I didn't hear that.
David Lifton.
Okay.
Okay, Bill, are you there?
Yeah, sure am. Thank you for taking my call. Thank you for taking my call, Brent. Hello, Joan. I have two questions. One is, and then I'll hang up and listen to your response. One is, did you ever get a chance to listen to the documentary that I believe John Barber did on Mr. Garrison, and is out for sale? And the second one is,
I'm sorry, I didn't get that. What?
I was wondering if you had ever watched the documentary that John Barber did with Mr. Garrison.
Let me just mention that John Barber, I went to Nevada, Las Vegas, and we had a program. John Barber showed his film, and then there was a panel discussion of three people after to talk about Garrison and the film, and I was one of the three, and also was Dick Russell and Jim Mars. And we are on that video that John put out that it's called the Garrison tapes, I believe.
Now that you've said that, I knew that. I forgot that the panel discussion afterwards.
Actually, that particular video, folks, just to clarify, is called The Last Word on the Assassination, and it does indeed include John Barber interviewing Dick Russell, who's a phenomenal researcher that works with Jesse Ventura all the time, and he's brought a great book out called, The
Man Who Knew Too Much.
Thank you, as my mind blanks. I need more coffee, I think. And also Jim Mars, who's people know has been on the show, and Joan as well.
And
that was great fun. I had never been to Las Vegas. That was really something.
Brent, my second question, Joan, is I just finished reading Bill Simpish's book, State Secret, and with regards to the tape conversations of the person who was holding himself out to be Oswald in tape conversations that originated from the Cuban embassy to the Soviet embassy, and that those tapes were withheld. CIA didn't want anyone to know about them, because it showed that there was, this was in October of '63, that someone was trying to set up Oswald. And as an American citizen, when I read that, it just pissed me off that this information, would be withheld. My
goodness, all the documents were withheld. The only reason we see any of this material is, I have to say, we should say, thanks to Oliver Stone. Because if he hadn't made JFK and people hadn't written into the United States Congress and demanded to know, well, what is going on here? What really happened to President Kennedy? And this was during the Clinton administration. They would never have passed the John F. Kennedy Records Collection Act, and we would see nothing. They were not every single book that was written in the last 20 years benefits from the archives where those documents sit. And so that they withhold the documents from Mexico City, that's just one example among thousands and thousands of documents. And Garrison, of course, during the time of his case, he wanted the Warren Commission exhibits, and he was begging Lyndon Johnson, it's ironic, to release those documents. Eventually, of course, they are released, but none of this would have happened without the film JFK. And I was starting to say when we had our previous hour that my students, these are students who knew nothing, they didn't know who Eisenhower was, they didn't know who President Kennedy was. The film made an enormous impression on them. I mean, we're so used to it now. We see its flaws, we see this, but the film just opened their eyes. And I'm not an expert as far as Mexico City is concerned. That's not really my basic field. I've done, I should just say, after A Farewell to Justice, I did a book about the CIA in Cuba. And that book, The Great Game in Cuba, I used that locution, The Great Game. It's from Britain and from John le Carré, and that's the way MI6, they had this satire against themselves, and they called themselves The Great Game. I was describing in that book CIA's behavior in the years following the Castro Revolution. And after that, what I've devoted my time to really was Texas. And that is, I wanted to know about the defense contractors in Texas and their relationship to CIA as a way of taking up Garrison's thought that CIA was behind the Kennedy assassination, and then looking at the CIA, and I think Brent was talking about that before, CIA's power in the society, what role they're playing, what role they're not elected by anyone, what role they're playing in the power structure. And so I did a book about Haiti also called Our Man in Haiti, about George de Mohrenschildt. And he, of course, was a long-time CIA asset, and he was Oswald's handler in Fort Worth and in Dallas. And that book describes de Mohrenschildt. After Oswald goes to New Orleans in April, de Mohrenschildt then goes to Haiti, and he gets involved with various schemes down there. And so and after that, I looked back at Texas, and I thought I would write about Brown and Root, because I found a document which is extraordinary, which shows that Herman and George Brown both, as well as a long list of executives of Brown and Root, were CIA assets, starting way back in the early 50s. Well, CIA, of course, only exists since 1947. And so after that, I'm looking at Brown and Root. And, of course, if you're looking at Brown and Root, you're also looking at the senator, or the person that was called the senator from Brown and Root, the person who went into the United States Senate, having lost the election for the Senate, and, as we know, became the successor to President Kennedy. So that doesn't answer your question about Mexico City, mainly because I'm not an expert in Mexico City, except that one thing I'd like to mention, and that is J. Edgar Hoover's telephone call to Johnson on the day of I think the Sunday after the assassination, and that call says, "We have a problem." And that was because the photographs that were taken that was said to be Oswald in Mexico City were, of course, not Oswald. So this was known by them way, way back, and only later, little bits, and we get some sense of that. Oswald, I suppose, was following the plan that he had described in the East Louisiana State Hospital at Jackson. He was going to go to Cuba, and maybe, and I don't like to speculate what somebody would have done. But it looks like it was part of his being set up to possibly get involved with some plan against Castro. So I'm sorry, I think I went around your question.
No, that's perfect. And I should mention, you just mentioned Brown and Root, and they became Halliburton folks. Brown and Root during the Vietnam War, and Joan will correct me on this if I'm wrong, were arms suppliers. And they became Halliburton, if I'm not mistaken.
I want to tell you about Brown and Root. I know everything. I know a lot. Brown and Root were at first construction people. They built bridges and they built things. Then Lyndon Johnson got them a contract to build the Marshall Ford Dam in outside Austin, and that was their first government contract. And ever since, from then on, Johnson was and they were facilitating Johnson. They paid for his political campaigns. During the first naval station for World War II in Corpus Christi was a contract that Johnson gave Brown and Root, and that set them up, really. But I want to say something about, can I be chauvinistic a little bit? Brown and Root were extraordinary builders. And the thing I have to mention, in New Orleans, during the Katrina floods and misery, there's one bridge in there that stood up and that was the bridge, the 24-mile span across Lake Pontchartrain. It's one way, and then the other span is going the opposite direction. And all the bridges over the Mississippi River cracked and broke and whatnot, all the buildings. The only buildings that were left standing in New Orleans that didn't get destroyed were the WPA buildings. That was from the Roosevelt administration in the 1930s. And the only bridge that didn't suffer a crack was built by Brown and Root. And the bridge that they built over Lake Pontchartrain, they built these bridges on shore, and then they put them into the water somehow. It was, of course, what they did in Vietnam. Brown and Root were sold, but Herman Brown died in December of 1962 for a heart attack. And George Brown didn't sign the contract to Halliburton. They sold Brown and Root to Halliburton until after his brother died. He just probably couldn't stand it. And so then they sold to Halliburton, and the rest we know. So I have to say is something, but meanwhile, of course, as I said, I found out that document, and I wasn't surprised, because in Vietnam, the Navy helped Halliburton, as if the Halliburton and Brown, what's called Brown and Root, were part of the U.S. military. It was one and the same. And George Brown once said, "Listen, all the oil is out there in the world. We want it. We want." And they would do what they needed to do to get it. All the military bases that were built after World War II, in Guam and Spain and every which place, all built by Brown and Root.
Incredible researcher, isn't she, folks? Joan Mellen is our guest tonight. www.nightfrightshow.com. Just click on tonight's guest book covers, plural. Take you right to a spot where you can order the books, and do get them.
If I have to recommend one of my books,
recommend
Farewell
them all.
to Justice.
Oh, I think they're all fabulous. The Great Game in Cuba, Jim Garrison is another one, and A Farewell to Justice. Now, let's go back to Oswald. We had alluded to Oswald being sheep-dipped in the first part of the show. And I was going to ask you, I've always been curious about the General Walker shooting. I am of the opinion that he did take that shot but missed him purposely in order to continue the sheep-dipping. And as an extension of that, I'm of the opinion that perhaps Oswald was in the 6th floor depository and took a shot but purposely missed JFK, and perhaps that shot ricocheted and hit James Tague. And you can tell me if I'm wrong, that's no problem. But
some of the things we just don't know for sure. And we could talk, why not? One of my publishers, the current publisher, said, why not speculate? I was so against speculation, only what we should write, only what we know. But sometimes we have to just see, well, what if, or maybe, and I think that's valid to look, given the information that we have. Jim Garrison thought that Oswald did not take a shot. And his argument for that, it may or may not be scientific, was that there was no paraffin residue on his hands or on his cheek. And so Garrison concluded that he didn't even take a shot. And I have to say that recently somebody came forward to me, a photographer, and he found a photograph at Love Field. We've never really seen the photographs from Love Field when Kennedy arrived in Dallas. And he sees Thomas Edward Beckham in the crowd. Now, it looks like, and a mugshot, he placed a mugshot of Beckham at the time on the bottom so we could compare. It's a dead ringer. If Beckham, now, so we have that. The person I showed that to for verification was a judge in Alabama called Judge Charlie, now retired, Charlie McKnight. And he knew Beckham way back when. A Farewell to Justice, by the way, the original version ends with Thomas Edward Beckham, who was a CIA patsy that was meant to take the place of Oswald should Oswald have run away, should he have not worked out and not been there, or something like that. Well, Charlie verified the photograph, and then he told me he had held back from me. See, the reason is he was an officer of the court, and he couldn't say anything about any of this, so he kept quiet. Finally, he retired. He told me that Thomas Edward Beckham had seen Oswald drinking a Coke outside the Texas School Book Depository 7 seconds before the shots rang out. Take it for what it's worth, and therefore there was no way that he said that Oswald could have gotten upstairs to the 6th floor. Now, I know Beckham was involved. I know that. I know that he doesn't even want to be heard from anymore, that he's went into undercover, and I think he regretted that he talked to me for a Farewell to Justice. And one of the things that happened when Oliver Stone, his assistant, was doing the research for the film JFK, and the researcher found Beckham, which was no small, easy thing to do. And he gets on the phone, and she said, "Is this Thomas Edward Beckham?" And he said, "Ma'am, I never heard of anyone by that name." So when you see the film JFK, Oliver Stone knew that Beckham was a very important figure in this, and he's not in the film. So I think one of the things that we have, writers, filmmakers, we have to deal with. These people are alive. They're frightened. They're terrified. I mean, after all, they were somehow complicit in the murder of the head of state. This is and there's no statute of limitations on that here. So I was really extremely lucky to get Beckham. Now I lost my train. Oh, I know. You were talking about Oswald being up in the 6th floor. Given that, I'm inclined to put a big question mark on whether Oswald was up there. And somebody said they saw him in the cafeteria eating a sandwich. This is well known, long time. Couldn't have gotten up there in time, wasn't there. And then, of course, we have the book in which there were 2 Oswalds. And this gets us into another thing. I have to put a question mark. I don't know.
Oh, that's a fair enough answer. What do you think about the Walker shooting? Do you think he took the shot?
The Walker. Well, I agree. I think what you said was very shrewd. I want to add another speculation about the Walker shooting. I could not find the document. I tried my darndest, and that is that according to what I heard, and I haven't got the document, after the Oswald was suspected for shooting at Walker. For some, I don't know whether George de Mohrenschildt reported him or his wife reported him to the Dallas police. And Bobby Kennedy called up the Dallas police and said, "Don't investigate this."
Really?
Now,
Wow.
I have to confess, I don't have, and there was a researcher, that Irving Heinemann, oh God, is he still alive? I don't know, but he knew about this. It's known. But I try to get to Dallas. Our records are in the storehouse, in the warehouse. We can't find it. That's under deep cover-up. But wouldn't it be? Isn't that interesting? That you see, and that also would be further evidence of Bobby Kennedy's awareness of Oswald just around that time. And I forgot to mention another thing. So one of Bobby Kennedy's friends, I think it was the John Siegenthaler, who was running a constitutional center in Vanderbilt University. I called him, a very nice man, and he said, "Why don't you call up the Kennedy Library and ask to see Angie Novello's diaries?" Angie Novello was Bobby Kennedy's secretary. And look and see where he was in 1963. And maybe we can have an idea of whether he was at Homestead Air Force Base, as I said earlier, where I got the information, let's call it, quote unquote, that Bobby Kennedy had spoken and Oswald was in the audience. So I call up the Kennedy Library, and what do you think they say? They have all of Angie Novello's diaries, daily diaries, except for 1963. And don't call again, they said. Don't ask any of our curators again because we don't have it. So that was withdrawn from the Kennedy Library. Another document, by the way, that was withdrawn from the Kennedy Library was the Bruce Lovett report. And that's a report about CIA commissioned by President Eisenhower in 1956 as a true look, an honest look at what the clandestine services of CIA were about. Arthur Schlesinger read the Bruce Lovett report in the Bobby Kennedy papers at the Kennedy Library, and we know that because he quotes from it in his book, The Life and Times of Robert Kennedy. You try to find that report. First of all, the Kennedy Library no longer has it. David Bruce's papers don't have it. President Eisenhower's archives don't have it. Robert Lovett, who was the co-author, it's not in his papers. I think they're at Yale. Schlesinger's papers, which are at the City University of New York, no. You cannot find the Bruce Lovett or CIA archives. Well, forget it. National Archives, no. Where is the Bruce Lovett report? Now, there's a redacted part of it in a book called Legacy of Ashes by Tim Weiner. All the good parts, quote unquote, are not there. It's all bland. You wouldn't think it was of any interest at all. So CIA gave Weiner a redacted copy, which is useless. So how hard this, I guess, is on the subject of how hard it is to do this research. I'm very sorry not to have found that paper of the Dallas police report on Bobby Kennedy's call, telling them not to investigate General Walker's shooting.
That's explosive, nonetheless, Joan. That's incredible research. By the way,
maybe someday we don't give up.
Oh, absolutely.
Someday, who knows?
No, the torch has been passed to a new generation of Americans, folks. By the way, both of us, Joan Mellen's our guest tonight, folks. We're looking at the Kennedy assassination, and none better tonight than with Joan Mellen, who's an expert researcher. The books are called The Great Game in Cuba. Jim Garrison is another book, and A Farewell to Justice. We were both down for the 50th anniversary in Dallas, Joan, and you're familiar with Sherry Feaster. Are you familiar with her work? She's a crime scene investigator.
I'm not. I know who she is. She's Deborah Conway. For me, she's Deborah Conway's sister. Because Deborah, who has run JFK Lancer meetings for now, she's ill, but for many years, is the person who published. You see, when I wrote A Farewell to Justice originally, it was 1,500 pages, and no publisher would publish it. So I decided, okay, I'll take what I can get. I published the part of A Farewell to Justice, which is about Jim Garrison's investigation. I thought that was what people were interested in. But what about Garrison's career in politics prior to the Kennedy investigation? And his childhood and his career in the U.S. Army, which is very interesting, and all of that. So that book was published by Deborah Conway at JFK Lancer. That one is called Jim Garrison, His Life and Times. So I know Deborah because it was her idea, and I thought that was pretty imaginative and kind of her to put Jim Garrison's whole life to be available to anybody who wants to know about it. So that's, I've met Sherry at the conferences, but I confess I have not read her work.
Fair enough, and I'll just tell you very quickly, folks. Sherry Feaster is a crime scene investigator. She's retired now, but she took a look at the Zapruder film, and she was able to establish through using 2,000, this century's modern crime scene techniques, just like you see on all the CSI shows, a frontal shot based on what she viewed on the Zapruder film. So there's more further evidence that indeed there was more than one shooter in DEALEY PLAZA, November 22nd, 1963, and further evidence and corroboration that it was indeed a conspiracy. You had mentioned George de Mohrenschildt before. Can we talk a little bit about him and how his role with Oswald came about, and essentially what happened through his narrative? Because we know he ended up dead just before he was supposed to give a testimony to the House Select Committee.
Excellent. And you know what I did when I did the story of George de Mohrenschildt, I found a person named Joe Dreyer who ran Kenaf. Kenaf is a substance that's like jute, and he had a Kenaf plantation in Cuba, and then he went to Haiti, and because after Castro came in, and he did Kenaf there, and they were making rope, and he had a lot of trouble with Duvalier and all that, and so he eventually left Haiti. But he got to know George de Mohrenschildt in Haiti, and so when Joe Dreyer went back to Florida, one day he got a telephone from George de Mohrenschildt. And de Mohrenschildt says, this is in 1977, George de Mohrenschildt says, Joe, let's have lunch today. And Joe Dreyer was working for some investment company, and he said, not today, how about tomorrow, George? And George says, fine, and de Mohrenschildt gives Dreyer the address, and it's some fancy place down there. And they were all set to have lunch. And, of course, the day that they were set to have lunch, de Mohrenschildt said, I want to talk to you about something. Now, Joe Dreyer is a very easy guy to talk to, very well connected, intelligence connected. And he said, I really want to talk to you. Well, the day, you can guess what's coming, the day that they were to have the lunch, that's the moment that George de Mohrenschildt died. So Joe Dreyer did a little research on this, and he finds out that the maid in the house where de Mohrenschildt was staying, it was a distant relative he was staying with, heard a car pull away shortly after de Mohrenschildt was shot. Now, these things are not part of public record right now, but certainly Joe Dreyer is a totally honest person. I mean, he's just not he doesn't make things up. He's too fancy for that. And I believe him that de Mohrenschildt was murdered. So that's the Morenschel. Why was he murdered? He was, as it was another man, like in the book, The Man Who Knew Too Much. He was another man who knew too much. He was recruited by CIA. Well, it was recruited long, long before, but the first jobs that he had for CIA were in the 1950s. He went to Yugoslavia for CIA, and, supposedly he's looking for oil. Really, he's spying on everybody. And he went to Hungary, and he went to Ghana, and various countries. And he's reporting to J. Walton Moore. J. Walton Moore was the chief of the CIA field office in Dallas. And it's Moore who sends de Morenschel to go to visit Oswald. The idea that George de Morenschel, who fancied himself a baron and nobility and all this, would associate with a nondescript, uneducated Marine down at the heels is ludicrous. It's obviously a CIA assignment. It's very similar, in fact, to Clay Shaw's assignment in New Orleans. I have to tell you that one of the funny things is a huge file in the National Archives of clippings and papers having to do with Clay Shaw and Oswald. And on the cover, on the jacket of the file, it says, and I may have this backwards. I think that's correct. And on the file it says George de Morenschel. In other words, for CIA, in their own minds, and I have this in the book, Our Man in Haiti, in their minds, these two people are interchangeable. The function that de Morenschel performed for CIA with Oswald in Dallas is exactly the same as what Shaw did for CIA in New Orleans, shepherding him around, setting him up, watching everything that he does, and so forth. So what was your question of de Morenschel? Let's go back to that.
No, I think you've answered it, because I was asking what the connection was, what his role was, that he should be silenced just before the House Select Committee on Assassinations.
Well, you see, after the Kennedy assassination, George de Morenschel at the time of the Kennedy assassination was in Haiti. He wasn't in Dallas. But he knew too much. He went to testify before the Warren Commission. He just, he knew of CIA's connection to Oswald. Isn't that enough? So the agency wanted no part of him. And one of the things that James Angleton did, we mentioned him earlier, as the chief of CIA counterintelligence, was they monitored de Morenschel's mail in Haiti. Every single letter that he got, they opened. And then they gave all the names of the people who corresponded with de Morenschel to the FBI to investigate one of those people. They never found anything of any great interest as far as I could see. But the FBI cooperated with CIA. As you know, it's a myth. People often put out that myth that CIA and FBI are enemies, rivals. In fact, they more often than not work together in tandem. And this was one example of that. And Hoover didn't like it, of course, because he doesn't want to be told what to do, but they did it. And none of it came to anything. Eventually, Duvalier threw de Morenschel out of Haiti. He never got paid what he was supposed to get paid, but I don't know what he ever did to earn what he was supposed to be paid. And he goes back to the United States and sort of asks people for help in extracting the money that he supposedly was owed from Duvalier. He never got anywhere. Nobody listened. Lyndon Johnson, he wrote to Johnson. He wanted no part of him, and so forth. I was very interested in what you said, Brent, about the new forensic techniques.
Sure,
because I found when I was researching Mac Wallace, one of the things that this supposed henchman of Lyndon Johnson, one of the things that was supposedly true was that his fingerprint was found on a book carton in the Texas School Book Depository. This was wisdom, everybody, yes, yes. And they had some forensic examiners in Dallas that verified it. And I decided...
Joan, can you tell folks who Mac Wallace was?
I'm sorry, Mac Wallace was just a young Texan who was president of the student body at the University of Texas. And when he fell on hard times, Lyndon Johnson helped him. Lyndon Johnson cultivated students at the University of Texas. One was John Connolly, one was Lloyd Hand, Barefoot Sanders, the whole group of people that Johnson sort of recruited to work for him. So when Mac Wallace sort of found himself in hard times, Johnson gave him a job at the Department of Agriculture in Washington. And Wallace did various jobs for Johnson, including babysitting his irrational sister, Josepha. And eventually Mac Wallace kills a man and it's a whole story. I don't go into that, but anyway, it winds up after Mac Wallace's death. He died shortly before Lyndon Johnson, 1971. Johnson died in 1973. After they died, Billy Salestes, I won't even go into him, he was a scam artist and a convicted felon by the time we catch up with him, starts saying that Mac Wallace was killing a lot of people on behalf of Lyndon Johnson. Then comes a researcher in Dallas who says there's an unidentified fingerprint in the Warren Commission exhibits, just says unknown. And this was taken from a carton in the Texas School Book Depository 6th floor. So this person says it's going to be, I'll find out if it's Mac Wallace. Just out of the blue, it's Mac Wallace. So, and then therefore he'd be involved with the Kennedy assassination if he's up there, because these fingerprints don't last long on carton. Anyway, his name is John Fraser Harrison. Jay Harrison hired some forensic examiners, and oh yes, it was him. It was his print. And much was made of this, because if he's there, he's not there on his own behalf. He must be there because of Lyndon Johnson, because he has a connection with Johnson. So anyway, when I'm doing this book about Johnson and Mac Wallace, part of what I did was I hired my own forensic examiner using the more modern techniques of digital forensics to take another look at the fingerprint. And I also had other prints that weren't had before. They weren't available. It was in the Navy. Mac Wallace had joined the Marines, so there were new U.S. Navy prints. And what I find is it's a miracle that I found this man. He also was an officer in the organization that certified latent print examiners, including the two that Jay Harrison had used. So he does some digital work it's all computer work, and it's not a match. The two prints that we had of Wallace, one from Austin, one from the Navy, matched. The one from the Warren Commission exhibit did not match. Whoa. So I think I spoke about this in Dallas last November at the conference. Shock, because everybody wanted to believe that Lyndon Johnson was behind the Kennedy assassination. And they needed this fingerprint in order to really make a case. You don't have the fingerprint, what are you going to do now? And I think that CIA has done such a good job of planting various suspects, false sponsors of the Kennedy assassination. Early on, one of their false sponsors was Fidel Castro. That didn't stick. Then, if you recall, the Mafia was the chief alternate. Was the Mafia did it, and there were several books, many books written about that, including one set in New Orleans called Mafia Kingfish. And then that died out, didn't stick, so the next false sponsor was Lyndon Johnson. But you had to have some evidence. The fact that he became president could very well be that they kept him deniable and that he did what he was told to do, but wasn't actually involved in the implementation of the assassination. You can't find evidence that he was involved. So that's sort of where I don't know how I got onto I wanted to talk about the forensics. But in that case, fingerprints really require a kind of technology that wasn't available even in the 1990s when Jay Harrison supposedly discovered that fingerprint. That was an aside, because I'm conscious of the last decade and all these books that come out that was saying that Lyndon Johnson really, and his friends, his lawyer, his right-hand man, Cliff Carter, that these were responsible for they never say no's to CIA, but they never include the New Orleans evidence. They can't, because there are no Texans, there's no Lyndon Johnson, there's no Mac Wallace. The New Orleans evidence is different, so they just never mention it. It's kind of discouraging to see all this, and I think I spoke to somebody today who asked me about one of those books, and perfectly intelligent person. What do people know? Because people don't examine the endnotes. They don't examine the documents, at least the identification of the documents. And as a result, anything goes. And I think we see this most recently in a book by someone called Roger Stone. Not a single footnote. Very inconvenient. But now the standards have disappeared, I think. And that's probably why the people who write books about the assassination have not earned the respect of conventional historians. The scholarship isn't there. That's my complaint.
No, I agree with you completely, and I think that starts in the schools, and I don't like what's happening in the schools right now either. And I know you're close to the student population as well as I am, and you had mentioned...
Are you teaching? Do you teach?
No, but this show is broadcast through the campus system here in Canada, with stations right across the country. And, you know, I'm going to tell you something funny, Joan, but it's more than funny. It's kind of sad. I did a show on the 100th anniversary of the Titanic, and I had students writing me, asking me, well, telling me, first of all, they had no idea the Titanic was a real story, but the classic email I got was, whatever happened to Jack? Now, Jack, of course, was the DiCaprio character played in the Titanic. That's the disconnect we're dealing with today, folks, and that's no word of a lie. I wanted to ask you, do you feel that LBJ was responsible in any way for the assassination? I don't. And
I agree with you, and I don't see what evidence you have. And this person asked me this, what is the evidence? And if you think about it, the only evidence that we have is from Billy Solestes, convicted felon, and by the way, when Billy Solestes got on the stand, the second trial, the second time he went to prison, he said, I just want you, talking to the jury, I just want you to know I'm a liar, and I exaggerate, and I'm given to boasting. So you can use him as your source, plus the other source is Johnson's mistress named Madeline Brown. Madeline Brown supposedly went to a party on November 21st, the night before the assassination, and she said that after Lyndon Johnson came there, and he told her, after tomorrow, the Kennedys will never bother me again. That's not a threat. That's a promise. Do you want to use her as your witness? She described the guests who were at the party. Every time she described the guests, different group. One time she said Herman Brown was there, of Brown and Root, and then somebody must have told her Herman Brown died the year before. Couldn't have been at the party. Sometimes she had Mac Wallace at the party. Sometimes she didn't. I don't see her as a credible source at all. I think she was also, we noticed that in videos and books, she appears with Billy Solestes, like a Punch and Judy show. So I don't know what their game is, I don't know. Both are dead now, of course.
Yeah, I had interviewed, I have Ted Sorensen, who was JFK's speechwriter. I have his last interview. I was down at his Manhattan apartment and spent the afternoon with him. And folks,
oh, really? Ted Sorensen?
Yeah. And it's my book will be out next week, folks. Finally. It was supposed to be out in time for Dallas, but it never happened. And I'm also working on a documentary about his life, including his last video. And folks, it's explosive because he confirms conspiracy, but not a coup d'etat. And guess what? Guess what's still in Cuba that never got removed? And that's one of the reasons for the cover-up, by the way. Anyways, more about that later. I just want to tell you who we're speaking with tonight. We are talking about the JFK assassination. As you know, nobody but Night Fright covers this, in this genre, covers this assassination the same way. The book is called The Great Game in Cuba. Another book is Jim Garrison, and another book, A Farewell to Justice. Our researcher and guest tonight, Joan Mellen, www.nightfrightshow.com. And I have a confession to make. All night long, you've heard me mute the microphone. And I'm doing this actually from a coffee shop. I'll tell you what happened. At 7:40 tonight, our internet went out at home. I can't do the show without internet. Called up a series of friends, but everybody had plans to go see the fireworks because it's Canada Day. So I ended up in a coffee shop, and I apologize for the background noise, but it was an emergency situation, and I did not want to cancel on Joan because she's far too nice to come on the show and share her knowledge with us. I want to switch gears just for a second now, Joan, and come back to Haiti, because I'm originally from Montreal, and there's a huge Haitian population there because the first language of Haitians, folks, is French, and when they immigrate to Canada, they primarily, of course, they go to Montreal. Was the CIA part and parcel to propping up Papa Doc Duvalier and Baby Doc?
You see, during the time that President Kennedy was still alive, he didn't want, after all the business with the Cuban Missile Crisis, he really put his foot down about, Helms naturally wanted to go in there, of course, and all, but they didn't. But CIA had an enormous presence in Haiti at the time that de Mohrenschildt was there. And in fact, the documents that I have the CIA put someone onto de Mohrenschildt. And he went to every dinner party. I think de Mohrenschildt was sort of a very nihilistic person. He knew it and he didn't care. Anyway, I have the dialogue of the parties, the dinner table, who's sitting there, who's saying what, and all of that. So CIA had a net really over Haiti. But at the time, they let me just put another point I should have mentioned. De Mohrenschildt went down to Haiti to accompany a new Oswald, or a new figure just like Oswald. His name was Clemar Joseph Charles. He was a banker, and he worked for Duvalier. At the same time, he wanted CIA to overthrow Duvalier and put him in as president of Haiti. And that's really at the heart of the story of my book, Our Man in Haiti. When I said Our Man in Haiti, who is our man? Is it de Mohrenschildt? Is it Clemar Joseph Charles? Is it Duvalier himself? Who? And so the story is about how Charles tries to get CIA, and of course once Johnson becomes president, it doesn't matter what anybody does, but CIA somehow is reluctant, they're afraid. One of the things about CIA that I write about in both Our Man in Haiti and in The Great Game in Cuba, how CIA would never support someone that they couldn't control. And there's a scene in The Great Game in Cuba in which a Cuban rancher named Gustavo de los Reyes goes to see Allen Dulles. And de los Reyes was involved in a plot of cattlemen. He was a rancher himself to overthrow Castro. This was as early as August of 1959, some months after the Castro took power on January 1st, 1959. And he goes to see Allen Dulles, and he's telling him, he's sort of asking for help, but he's not quite sure what kind of help. And he says, and so Dulles says, "How much money do you need?" And de los Reyes, who's a very proud man, says, "I don't want your money. We just came up here to inform you of what we're doing." And so Dulles says something like, "Well, you're going to wind up in the cemetery." And he did. He lived to be 100, by the way. He didn't. But de los Reyes says, he said, "I'd rather be in the cemetery than live under Castro." So he leaves, and he eventually wound up 4 years on the Isle of Pines. But it really shows you about CIA. If they can control you, if you take their money, they want you to take their money. If you take their money and then you're under their control, they'll help you. And if you don't, if you refuse their money, they know what that means. It means that you're not going to do what they say, and so then they don't want to have anything to do with you. And this was true of Clemar Joseph Charles in certain ways, and it was also true in Cuba. We think the fashionable view is that CIA wanted to overthrow Fidel Castro or they wanted to overthrow Duvalier. Nothing doing. They were not going to do it unless they were certain that the person that they put in place, or the one they deposed, is controlled by them. And then finally, the CIA doesn't want anything to do with Haiti, anything to do with Cuba. They have better area to investigate, and we know what that is. It was Vietnam. Because CIA was operating on behalf of its client states, client organizations, defense contractors, like Brown and Root, a prime example, and they made a fortune in Vietnam. And they don't want to, the CIA is happy about that. That's what they exist for. The idea that they're protecting national security is a joke. It's been that way since the beginning when they created the Cold War. What were they doing? They were facilitating the rearming of the United States after World War II, when everybody had enough of war. So CIA has to create a pretext that we really need all these arms because the Russians, we have a new enemy, the Russians. And so we had that Cold War for years, and, it bankrupted the Soviet Union more than it did us, but it didn't do us any good either. And what happened to all those arms? They're all obsolete now. They never were used.
Through your extraordinary, we're going to have to start to wrap up because we've only got 6 minutes left. But through your extraordinary research, are there lessons learned from back then during that era that we can transpose to today?
That's a good question. I think we should go back and oppose these wars. Even though, things are different now. When you can't protest, they throw you in a box and you can't go to the bathroom and everything. They don't let you protest the way they used to. But we have to even be more diligent. And because I think what happened in Vietnam was the enormous outcry of people in the streets that didn't want this war. Created havoc. Lyndon Johnson couldn't walk into a public building in the front with the front door without getting people yelling and hey, how many kids did you kill today and all that. And I think we need to look for the truth. We need to fight harder. We need to fight the National Archives when they refuse to give us the documents that they have still withheld, promising that they'll give them in 2017. We have to work very hard. We have to support, and there's no joy in it. There's no money in it. As you said, you're doing this for a volunteer. It's just for the sake of the truth, and we have to be willing to make sacrifices in order to keep the government honest and make a better country. I'm speaking more of the United States than of Canada. You're not guilty of this. As far as I know.
We have our moments, trust me. All I have to say is I can reference two Canadians that will break the stereotype of Canada. Rob Ford, the Toronto mayor.
Oh, gosh.
And Justin Bieber.
No, I didn't realize Justin Bieber was Canadian. Sorry.
Certainly don't walk on water here either, folks.
Well, those are relatively minor compared to the misery that, has gone on here. And everybody who raised any questions, look at all those assassinations. That quieted people down for a good long time. But every politician that would dare say anything and get anywhere near being elected gets killed, or something happens, or there are ways of defeating people. I think that we have to try to get the younger generation to care. Because what they do, my students, are in their 20s and 30s, they're afraid, and they just step back and hide. And I don't think you can live a life in a foxhole, or maybe you shouldn't want to live life in a foxhole.
I agree completely. Peter Dale Scott, another fellow Canadian, by the way, folks, went to McGill, as did I, but we're not of the same ilk or the same era, or the same vintage, if you will. His thesis is follow the drug money. Do you think that plays a big part in keeping the CIA's funding going?
Well, I don't know, because you see, Dulles, in the days of Dulles, when he used to go to Congress and ask for his budget, he got whatever he wanted. Later, of course, they did use the drug trade and all, but I really think that's the least of it, honestly. I really think what it is they want to keep the world open for American business. And one of the ways that they've been doing that is destabilizing many countries, dividing them into many small countries, and putting them in debt to the World Bank and to the International Monetary Fund. Like the example most recently, obviously, is Ukraine, and so that we then can walk in and have control over all these places in a way that we couldn't if they were a single national entity. So we're in favor of turmoil, of war, of disruption, and we're part of that. And I think that the CIA plays an enormous role in that, and more than anybody else, more than any president or any Congress is useless here. And I don't know, it's pretty hard to fight.
As soon as you said dividing up into smaller countries, the first thing I thought of what's going on today in Iraq, where I think we're going to see 3 smaller countries emerge from.
There you go. That's a perfect example, isn't it? Suddenly this happens out of the blue. You see, it's really in our interest, certain people's interest. It's not in the interest of the general population that's getting poorer and poorer, but it's in the financial interest, the defense contractors and bankers, whatever, and they sort of appropriating the wealth of the entire planet. And they use the military to do it. These kids are going, my God. What is it? I got a letter, the same letter I was talking about, from a Vietnam vet. How looking back on it, he was horrified. And I said, well, when you were on the USS Liberty, I was protesting against the Vietnam War in Central Park. And he said, God bless you. We try to stop it. We try to say, don't go, and things like that. And, of course, it was hard. He couldn't do it.
Do you think oil plays a big part of it in Iraq? I'll tell you why. I'm going to be a paranoid Canadian for a second. Many people don't realize that Canada supplies the most oil of all the nations to the United States. We're the United States' biggest supplier of oil. Do you think oil plays a big part?
That's very interesting. Why do we always, we're looking ahead. We don't want any oil in anyone's hands but ours. So yes, you should supply it now, but what if you don't supply it? Then we need to get it elsewhere. So we want to appropriate all these places where there's oil. Certainly oil is a major force in that. That's very interesting about Canada. I hope you get a profit from it.
I'll tell you, your gas prices are cheaper than ours. Don't ask me how that works, because I have no idea. All I know is that whenever I've been in the States, and I'm only 10 minutes from the border, it's virtually right across the river. The prices are much cheaper than what we're paying in Canada, yet we have the second largest oil reserves in the world, only next to Saudi Arabia. And,
that's fascinating. I didn't know it.
Yeah, and the most fresh water, by the way. So that makes us a prime target in the next 50 years for a lot of people.
Well, I have to say that place at the Canadian border where I was in Leamington, Vermont, it was so beautiful. It just took my breath away.
Thank you kindly. We're gonna have
to. You're just right there.
We're right there. We're right there. I'm going to have to start to wrap up because the music is going to start in about 30 seconds, I'm estimating. And as soon as I say that one word, folks, I know you're all laughing right now, about. I'm working on it. Our guest tonight has been Joan Mellen. The book is called The Great Game in Cuba. Another book, she's written a terrific book called Jim Garrison. And Jim Garrison was the main character in the movie JFK. And another fantastic book, which is one on my shelf, A Farewell to Justice, www.nightfrightshow.com. Thank you all for joining us tonight. I'm just going to ask Joan one last thing. What's next for you, my friend?
After my book about Mac Wallace and Lyndon Johnson comes out, it's a book on the USS Liberty, which we have to talk about another time, but it's a fascinating story.
Yeah,
Thank you so much, Brent, for putting me on the program. I enjoyed it.
I thoroughly enjoyed it, Joan. You are welcome here anytime, my friend. And my thanks to John Barber for putting me in touch with you as well, because he was and another Canadian. Canadians everywhere today, folks. What can we say? It's Canada Day.
Happy Canada Day.
God bless, my friend. Take care.
Bye.
Bye.